4-month-old baby girl looking out on her surroundings. It's easy for us to assume that basically she understands her environment in the same way an adult does, and that the only thing she lacks is knowledge, which she is, however, continuously and busily building up. But how does she understand her world? What does she make of the objects she sees around her, her toys, her mother? These questions about her ideas, her thoughts, her impressions, about how she understands her surroundings, are questions about her mental world, about what psychologists call mental representations. The development of these representations has been of enormous interest to psychologists and philosophers for a long time.
Psychology is the study of human behavior, and psychologists of all persuasions know that human behavior is controlled by a system of representations, which we now take to be largely encoded in the brain, indeed entirely encoded in the brain. So to study human behavior and its causes, one studies representation, how human beings represent the world. And psychologists of all persuasions also believe that the roots of our system of representation are laid down in infancy.
But how can we know what sort of mental representations babies do have? How can we find out about them? However hard we try, remembering our earliest childhood experiences seems impossible. We can't question babies about their experiences, and we can't directly observe what's going on in their minds. In this program, we look at just 2 accounts of infant representation and the methods used to explore how babies and children understand their surroundings. Both accounts suggest that the infant's mental world may not be what we assume it to be. Jean Piaget's theory has had the most powerful influence on developmental psychology over the last 60 years. Although he worked on many areas of developmental psychology, his ideas about infant representation have become the central focus for a critical debate. For Piaget, there was no doubt that the infant's world is radically different to the adult's.
The universe of the young baby is a world without objects, consisting only of shifting and unsubstantial tableaux which appear and are then reabsorbed, either without returning or reappearing in a modified or analogous form.
For Piaget, the young infant does not have mental representations and cannot form conscious memories of past events.
They don't have representations of objects, and they can't think with representations. So the newborn infant, the infant in the first 2 months, has no way of understanding, for example, the continued existence of objects when they can't be perceived directly, or they can't be acted upon. So an object that goes out of view, a parent that leaves the field of view, goes out of the room, ceases to exist. Really, what Piaget is saying is that babies come into the world with the very minimum of knowledge. They have a set of actually fairly complicated reflex activities, but these are reflexes. These are triggered by situations such as touching the baby's hand will trigger a grasping activity. Seeing something move in the front of the baby will trigger tracking. But the baby only understands very, very little of what's going on. Perceptual experiences are fleeting, they're not organized, the baby doesn't know anything about space and depth and distance, can't interpret what's happening. There is simply no understanding of the world as you or I would understand it.
Piaget's ideas about the nature of early mental representations were based on simple but careful observations of babies searching for objects that have been placed out of view. Piaget found that with babies like Rebecca, who's 5 months old, although she might be interested and excited by a toy, if it's then hidden while she's watching, then she behaves as if the toy simply ceases to exist. Piaget reported that there is a blank reaction. The baby just stops, doesn't know what to do, doesn't show any indication that she's aware the toy continues to exist.
Come it over. Where's it going? Oh, here it is. Here it is.
Gradually, the baby begins to focus some attention on the cover, but only for its own sake. So the child will reach out, grab the cover, play with it in some way, and then would notice this toy, this object was underneath, and would pick that up. And gradually, through this repeated experience, and also other experiences, other activities, such as the baby handling an object, moving it out of view, bringing it back in again, moving it behind something else, seeing it go out of existence, out of sight, out of existence, come back again, beginning to understand that the way to interpret what's happening is that the object does continue to exist.
For Piaget, these careful observations supported his idea that infants simply don't or can't represent things in their minds as stable, enduring objects, and that they can only develop this representation through repeated interaction with their world. And even when they do finally start searching, it doesn't mean they've fully developed the ability to represent objects.
Piaget made an important point. He claimed that when babies do begin to search, when they show evidence of being able to understand how to remove the cover and find a toy that's hidden, he was at pains to point out that this wasn't an indication that the baby was making use of a symbolic representation. The child didn't have an image of the hidden toy and was doing something to try and retrieve it. Instead, he claimed all that had been learned was the baby could carry out one activity, which was removing the cover, in order to carry out another activity, which is grabbing hold of the toy and doing something else with it, putting it in the mouth or examining it or something of that sort. And the reason for that was the what's come to be known as the classic A not B search task, which Piaget was the first to report.
At 8 months, Jessica has reached the point where she can complete the standard hide and retrieve task. Unlike Rebecca at 5 months, Jessica will successfully and repeatedly retrieve her toy when it's hidden in the same place.
Yeah, very nice.
But if the experimenter then changes where the object is hidden, Jessica will watch, but then turn back to the original hiding place and search there. For Piaget, this implied the child didn't have a mental representation of the object, but instead the object was understood in terms of the actions, sensory motor actions necessary to retrieve it, to bring it back into existence.
Piaget argued that this is evidence that the infant is not using a symbolic representation of the toy to follow its movements and understand where it is. Instead, the problem for the infant is that the object is understood in terms of the action, or the actions that are carried out on it. And if reaching at place A uncovers the object, then that is the object, in a very real sense, for the infant in the sensory motor stage. So hiding it at place B is meaningless. The baby doesn't understand that this original object is at a new place. Instead, it reaches back to A, because that is the way the object is uncovered. That's what creates the object. And Piaget was very clear on this. He claimed that the activity of removing cover A for the infant recreates the object.
The evidence for Piaget's ideas seems extremely robust. These observations, filmed some 60 years after Piaget first reported the behavior, show exactly the same result. And these observations have been repeated in labs all over the world. the same results are found each time. However, while the observations have stood the test of time, Piaget's theory of why infants behave as they do has been questioned. Just because they behave as if an object has disappeared doesn't necessarily imply that they really think the object has disappeared. It doesn't necessarily imply they have no mental or symbolic representations.
Piaget based the majority of his conclusions on tasks that required infants to be able to reach and grasp and pick up objects. Now, there are two problems there. One is that you're not able to test children who are younger, who are not able to reach and grasp. And we would wonder, how do infants come into the world? Is he actually right about his claim that the newborn doesn't know about the permanence of objects? The second is that it's just possible infants may have a symbolic representation of the object that's been hidden, but they just don't know how to retrieve it. The toy's been covered, and they don't know that all you have to do is to pick up this cover and move it away in a particular way, and there is the toy sitting there ready to be grasped. If they lack that information, then clearly they won't be able to search, but it's not because they don't have a symbolic representation, as Piaget claimed. We need some other ways of trying to find out exactly what the limits are on infants' performance.
So there are question marks over Piaget's account of infant representation. Some critics suggest that by 5 months it is possible for infants like Rebecca to represent permanent objects. What she can't do is work out a strategy to complete tasks presented to her in the experiments. The issue has still not been satisfactorily or finally resolved. But even if it was shown that infants at 5 months have some form of mental representation, Piaget may have been right about babies younger than Rebecca.
Unfortunately, we have very little information at that age. It's possible Piaget's explanation could be right for the newborn in the first couple of months, but it's such a difficult age group to study that the research hasn't yet been done, and that's something that we need to find out. More work has to be done there.
But there are other problems with Piagetian accounts of early infant representation. It's one thing to look at babies and their toys, but what about their relationships with people?
I think that the conclusion which Piaget drew, that there was a stage at which infants represented the world in this episodic way, is true and important. But I think that Piaget's own use of it was slightly thrown off by the fact that he did most of his experiments with inanimate objects. And I think that children's ways of representing animate objects, and in particular their ways of representing their mother or the people that are close to them, are distinct and different from their ways of representing objects in general.
The psychoanalytic school has always placed emotional relationships at the center of its theories. At the heart of many of Freud's ideas were the early relationships between child, mother, and father. Melanie Klein, who trained in the psychoanalytic tradition, also believed that any understanding of early experiences and representations would have to take into account the significance of infants' emotional worlds, their relationships not just with objects in general, but with people. The task then was to find a way of investigating these early relationships.
Freud found in his therapeutic work with adults that the way that they thought and felt about things was related to episodes in their early childhood. And he built up quite a detailed picture of the way little children back to about the ages of 3 and 4, represented things. And then Melanie Klein began analyzing children at that age. The change that made this possible was that she discovered that you could interpret children's play as reflecting their underlying motives, in the same way you could understand adult dreams or the things that adults said in analysis. And just as Freud drew conclusions about the emotional lives of children from his therapeutic work with adults, so Klein drew conclusions about the emotional life of babies from her work with children.
Much of Klein's work was founded in a therapeutic clinical setting. But like Freud's, her account of development is one that was intended to apply to all children. And psychologists working in the Kleinian tradition today find her ideas and methods useful in accounting for everyday behavior.
But I thought that what we could see here was some very meaningful play about a little girl who, as she said when she looked at it, found some sort of mess there. And I would have thought, really, that the mess that she found was not simply a disordered play people house, but something to do with the sort of rather confused mess of feelings she had inside her, which were evoked by this rather strange situation. But she diligently set about trying to clear up this mess. And towards the end, I noticed that she was stealing glances at the camera people. She'd have a little look at me from time to time, as though she was saying, "Is this all right? Is this what I'm meant to do?" I noticed that this sort of putting things in order, really, had a kind of effect of, in a way, stilling some of her anxieties.
So for Melanie Klein, a child's play, any child's play, is significant, meaningful. It's meaningful because it reflects the child's concerns, anxieties, and internal conflicts as they play. But a child's play is seen as reflecting more than just thoughts and feelings about the present. Klein believed it also reflects earlier experiences. It reveals residues of the child's earliest representations, not just of the here and now, but from the distant past, from infancy.
Melanie Klein takes it for granted, really, that in every child there is not only the child of, shall we say, 3 or 4, like the little girl we've just seen, but also still there the baby or the infant. And her picture of us all is of a model of the part of us that is most adult, which is, we hope, more or less in control of other parts of us, which, even if we are grown up, may be adolescent parts, child parts, or indeed baby parts still.
Through her work with children, it became apparent to Klein that a crucial element in understanding an infant's representation of the world is that a newborn is, from the very beginning, oriented to develop relations, human relations. And the relations are permeated with powerful positive and negative emotional forces which colored the baby's experience.
The close bond between a young infant and his mother centers on the relation to her breast. Although, from the earliest days onwards, the infant also responds to other features of the mother, her voice, her face, her hands. The fundamental experiences of happiness and love, of frustration and hatred, are inextricably linked with the mother's breast.
What is known as object relations theory, which builds on Klein's ideas, sees good and bad experiences as being represented quite separately in the infant's developing mental world.
The recurrent experiences of gratification and frustration are powerful stimuli for libidinal and destructive impulses, for love and hatred. As a result, the breast, inasmuch as it is gratifying, is loved and felt to be good. Insofar as it is a source of frustration, it is hated and felt to be bad.
According to Klein, babies don't represent their mothers as single, complete, enduring objects. Bad experiences are not, at first, represented as being connected with the good experiences. Babies have fundamentally fragmented representations of their mothers. Their first representations are part objects, bits of their mothers. For Klein, some of these part objects are associated with bad experiences. of hunger, frustration, and unhappiness, and they come to form part objects with hostile and persecutory qualities. The equally inevitable good experiences and the associations with the mother at these times go to make up, in the baby's mind, independent and unconnected part objects with wholly good qualities of satisfaction, love, and tenderness. So, at first, these good and bad parts are effectively distinct mental entities. The baby does not have a sense of one enduring person who is the mother. Although their ideas have their roots in very different approaches to explaining and investigating psychology, Klein's idea of part objects and Piaget's concept of the impermanent object have some striking similarities. In both accounts, the developmental task for the baby in relation to both the world of animate and inanimate objects is to construct, through experience, mental representations of objects in the world. It's perhaps also a task that is never quite complete.
There is a moment at which the baby starts in a kind of preliminary way, a piece of emotional work which really comes and goes all our lives. And that is a work of integration, which is a sort of stirring of a feeling that this person that the baby thought was so marvellous is the same person as the one they thought was so absolutely lousy. And that the one that in a way they have been cursing and thinking was, the witch of nightmares, that was Mummy too. Now this is a very long drawn out process, and we see the children of the girl we saw today, the children of her age. We see them dealing with exactly the same problem in their play very frequently. It's the work of growing up, really, to understand that your parents are neither very, very good nor very, very bad. They're human and ordinary.
But despite researchers' efforts, despite an ever-growing understanding of the mental world of infants, in the end, the true nature of their experience necessarily eludes us.
When we understand one another in daily life and give a description of our experience to one another, we take it that when the description is accurate, we also know what it's like to have that thought or feeling. So there's two things involved. There's a description of a thought or a feeling, and there's knowing what it's like to have it. Now, I think we can make substantial progress, and have made substantial progress, in giving accurate descriptions of a baby's thought and feelings. But we can't, with regard to those descriptions, know what it's like in the way we can know what it's like to feel adult things. We can never think away our adult experience and actually inhabit the world of the child.